Most women believe that the way to hold a man's attention is to fight for his gaze, to be louder, brighter, more present in his life than anything else. But the truth, the quiet, devastating truth, is that the deepest grip is formed when she walks away without turning back. The human psyche does not obsess over what it already possesses. It longs for what has dissolved into the horizon with composure. He may not understand it, but in the recesses of his mind, the image of her absence begins to bloom like a phantom, untouchable, unrelenting. She was not the type to slam doors or ignite chaos on her way out. Her departure was not a storm. It was a still lake swallowing its own reflection. Eckhart would call it the act of reclaiming projection. The moment she took back the fragments of herself, she had allowed him to mirror back to her. In her detachment, she gathered the lost pieces of her identity, no longer seeking validation in his eyes. And in that moment, she became a figure his subconscious could not exile. You have to understand the male unconscious. It is haunted by symbols, not logic. When she was there, warm and available, she was tangible, explainable. But the instant she stepped beyond his reach with calm certainty, she ceased to be a person in his mind and became an archetype, the one that got away, the silent queen, the untouchable anima. And men, whether they admit it or not, are drawn to that which mirrors their own unlived depths. He remembers her now in fragments. The way her voice softened at the edges when she spoke of something sacred, the way she listened without offering herself like an open wound, the way she never chased his silences but left them untouched like ancient ruins. Each recollection is a projection of his own longing, yet it feels to him like she still lives in the architecture of his dreams. He cannot command it. He cannot make it stop. The psyche works on its own clock, outside of willpower, weaving and reweaving the symbol of her until it becomes almost myth. Detachment, when done with grace, is not coldness. It is a form of spiritual transmutation. Eckhart Tolle speaks of the pain body, the accumulation of emotional pain we carry like sediment in our soul. She stopped feeding his. She stopped participating in the dance of reaction, the cycles of tension and release that kept them entangled. Her silence was not punishment, it was liberation. For herself, not for him. And yet, paradoxically, it became the very thing that bound him to her in his private hours. Perhaps you know this truth in your bones. When you no longer beg for explanation, when you refuse to orbit his moods, when your worth is not an offering but an unshakable fact, you become more than a presence. You become an absence that he cannot unsee. The mind, deprived of closure, searches endlessly for a door that no longer exists. She did not seek revenge. She sought alignment. She aligned with her own rhythm, her own breath, her own rising sun. She walked not into another man's arms, but into the wild expanse of her own becoming. The world noticed. Even the air around her seemed to carry a different frequency. People felt it without knowing why. The way the light found her differently. The way her words no longer strained to be understood. And he, somewhere far from her, began to feel a weight in his chest when her name crossed his mind. Not the sharp stab of regret, but the slow ache of something he could not retrieve. Jung would say he was facing his shadow in her absence, the unacknowledged truth that he had held something rare, and by neglect or complacency, let it slip away. Dreams became the only realm where he could touch her again. At night, when his guard was down, she would appear, not always speaking, sometimes only passing by, sometimes simply looking at him with the eyes that once read his soul. These dreams left him both full and empty, as though touching fire that disappears before it warms the skin. She was not coming back. That was the essence of her grace. She was not pretending to move on to provoke him. She had already gone somewhere deeper than his reach. That is why the dreams persisted. They were his unconscious trying to follow her, tracing the path of her becoming. But every morning he awoke alone, still on the shore where she had left him, staring at the horizon that had swallowed her silhouette. In the days that followed her departure, his world remained physically intact, but something invisible had shifted. The meals tasted the same, the streets were familiar, his friends still spoke of trivial things, yet everything felt slightly hollow, as though a subtle color had drained from the canvas of his life. What he could not articulate was that she had taken back not just herself, but the psychic energy he once drew from her presence. Jung wrote that when the anima, the feminine archetype within a man's unconscious, withdraws, the man is confronted with his own barren interior. This is what he felt now, a desert without her rain. She moved differently in her new life, not with the frantic energy of escape, but with the grounded poise of someone who had returned home to herself. The absence of urgency in her steps was the loudest message she could have sent. There was no performance, no display meant to lure his attention back. She was simply living, and this simplicity was her quiet defiance against the chaos of their past. You might think that the man would forget in time, that his mind would adjust to the void she left. But absence is not an empty space. It is a living thing, a presence in reverse. The psyche feeds on the unresolved, and, without closure, memories calcify into symbols. Each time he thought of her, he wasn't merely remembering a woman. He was communing with an archetype of loss, beauty, and grace beyond his comprehension. She understood something most never learn, that true empowerment does not come from dominating another's emotions, but from withdrawing the need to be validated by them. In Stoic thought, this is the highest freedom, to require nothing from those who cannot give it. Marcus Aurelius spoke of being like the rock the waves crash over, unmoved and unbroken. That was what she became. In his dreams, the encounters grew stranger. She no longer always looked at him. Sometimes she was facing away, walking toward a distant forest, her figure dissolving into mist. At other times, she was surrounded by people he didn't recognize, her laughter belonging to another life, inaccessible to him. These dream images were not random. They were messages from his unconscious telling him she had moved into a realm he could not enter without transformation of his own. There is a cruel truth in human desire. We often see someone most clearly when they no longer stand before us. While she was there, he mistook her patience for permanence. Now, stripped of her presence, he noticed the details with painful clarity. The way she never forced her voice into a conversation, the way her eyes held quiet storms she never asked him to navigate. These were not things he could touch anymore. They were shadows on the wall of a life that had already closed its door. And yet, the more he thought of her, the more he was drawn to the stillness she had mastered. Men are often addicted to pursuit, but what they rarely understand is that the most powerful pull comes from the one who is no longer playing the game. In her grace, she had become the echo he could not silence. For her, detachment was not a weapon. It was a ceremony. She had chosen herself without making it a declaration of war. This was her shadow work in motion, peeling away the layers of need, fear, and doubt that had once kept her entangled. She no longer sought to control the narrative, no longer worried about whether he understood her choice. The choice existed for her alone, and that was enough. And because she had left without bitterness, she remained untarnished in his memory. She was not the angry ex or the weeping lover. She was the woman who walked away with the kind of serenity one only gains through deep self-knowledge. This is why she lingered in his dreams, why even in waking hours he would see her in the curve of a stranger's smile, in the cadence of a voice on the street. He did not know it yet, but he was beginning his own confrontation with the shadow. Her absence forced him to look at the parts of himself he had avoided, his fear of abandonment, his tendency to take for granted what he believed was secure, his reluctance to meet someone at the depth they deserved. These realizations were not gentle. They arrived like sudden storms, leaving him unsettled and raw. But still, she did not return. Nights became his most vulnerable hours. In the daylight, distractions could dull the edge of her memory, the hum of work, the noise of traffic, the shallow laughter of acquaintances who knew nothing of what was gnawing at him inside. But when darkness fell and silence took hold, his mind wandered back to her with a precision that felt almost surgical. Every word she had spoken, every pause between them, every unspoken truth seemed to replay in high definition. It wasn't longing alone that kept her alive in him. It was the haunting sense that she had seen him in a way no one else ever had, and that vision was gone. In his dreams, she began to change. Sometimes she appeared luminous, as if lit from within, her skin carrying the glow of someone who had found a life beyond pain. At other times, she was untouchable, a figure seen through glass, close enough to see but forever beyond reach. This is the unconscious at work, shaping the lost beloved into an idealized figure, amplifying the gap between memory and reality. Jung knew this phenomenon well. The more a person exists only in the mind, the less human and the more mythic they become. She, in her own world, had not stopped growing. Detachment had not frozen her in time, it had accelerated her evolution. She was shedding old identities like autumn leaves, no longer defined by the dynamics that once tethered her to him. In Eckhart Tolle's language, she had stepped into the now, the space where the past has no weight and the future holds no fear. This made her not only unavailable, but spiritually unreachable to the version of him that had known her. And yet, this was the irony. The more she became unreachable, the more deeply she rooted herself into his psyche. Men are often conditioned to value conquest over connection, but in losing her, he was forced to face the hunger for a depth he had never cultivated in himself. His anima, the inner feminine, was calling to him through her image, urging him to integrate what he had projected onto her. But integration requires humility, and humility was a foreign language to his ego. She understood none of this in the clinical sense, but she lived it instinctively. Her boundaries were no longer rigid walls meant to keep danger out. They were living gates, opening only to those who met her in reciprocity. This subtle shift made her presence magnetic, even to strangers. People could sense her peace, the way it wasn't fragile or dependent on external approval. It was the kind of peace that cannot be faked, because it is forged in the fires of self-confrontation. You may not realize it yet, but there is a quiet power in not explaining yourself. She did not send long letters detailing her reasons. She did not circle back for one last argument. She did not need him to see her worth. She had seen it herself, and that was enough. This was her individuation, her liberation from the cycle of seeking her reflection in another's eyes. For him, the loss was compounded by the fact that there had been no dramatic ending to cling to, no final words to replay endlessly, no last fight to justify his bitterness. Only the memory of her leaving like a gentle tide retreating from the shore, taking with it the warmth that had once been his without effort. And this, perhaps, is the cruelest way to lose someone, not to have them ripped away, but to watch them dissolve into the life they were always meant to claim. The unconscious does not forget such departures. Even years later, a scent, a certain turn of phrase, a fleeting laugh in a crowded room could snap him back into the vivid awareness of her. He could try to fill the space she left, but substitutes have a way of revealing themselves. No one else carried the same combination of softness and sovereignty. No one else could stand in stillness without demanding to be noticed, yet still be impossible to ignore. And so, he dreamed. In these dreams, he reached for her, but his hands always closed on air. Sometimes she smiled at him, but it was never the smile of invitation. It was the smile of someone who had forgiven without the need for reconciliation. He would wake from these dreams with a mix of relief and grief, his heart heavy with the knowledge that her grace had not only set her free, but had left him in the shadow of what he could not reclaim. As the season shifted, he began to notice that her absence was no longer a temporary wound, but a permanent landscape within him. It wasn't that he thought of her every moment. It was that she had become a silent reference point, a measure against which all others were unconsciously compared. Even in new connections, some part of him was still searching for the quiet gravity she had carried, the way she could fill a room without trying, the way she could leave one without collapse. In the deep recesses of the psyche, such comparisons are not fair to the new faces in one's life, but they are inevitable when the past holds an unresolved archetype. Jung would remind us that what we do not make conscious will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. This was his reality now. Her image was no longer just her. It was his unintegrated longing, the feminine depth he had never met in himself, projected outward into a woman who had stopped waiting for him to catch up. Meanwhile, she was living without the anchor of his gaze. She had stepped fully into her own orbit, her own seasons. There was a subtle elegance in the way she inhabited her days now, not as an act of rebellion against him, but as a quiet return to the life she had abandoned in pieces while giving too much of herself away. Stoic wisdom teaches that the true test of strength is to hold oneself together in the absence of applause. This she had mastered, and because she was not chasing closure, she did not watch for signs of him watching her. She did not craft messages in the hope they would reach him through mutual friends. She did not even measure her progress in how much less she thought of him. Instead, she measured it in how fully she showed up for herself, in the book she finished, the morning she rose without dread, the laughter that no longer felt like a performance. Yet still, at night, he dreamed. These dreams had begun to change in tone. Where once they were tender, almost romantic, they now carried an undercurrent of urgency. He would call to her, and she would keep walking. He would run toward her, but the ground beneath him seemed endless, stretching into a horizon he could never reach. In the language of the unconscious, this was his psyche beginning to understand that she was not waiting for him to arrive. There is a strange thing that happens when a man finally realizes the door has closed. His longing intensifies before it dissolves. It is as if the mind makes one last desperate attempt to reclaim what it has lost, flooding itself with memories, fantasies, and imagined futures. But the more he reached for her in his thoughts, the more he was met with the echo of his own inaction from the past. He could not change the fact that when she needed him to meet her at depth, he had remained at the surface. She no longer carried resentment for this. She had moved beyond it, not by forcing forgiveness, but by no longer standing in the place where the hurt had occurred. She understood now that healing does not mean the wound never happened. It means the wound no longer controls the way you move. This, too, is the wisdom of shadow work. You stop waiting for the person who hurt you to undo it, and you learn to live in a way that no longer requires their repair. For him, this was perhaps the hardest truth to swallow, that her peace was not the result of his apology, nor contingent on his change. It had bloomed entirely without his involvement, and that made it both beautiful and unbearable. It meant she was free in a way he had never been, and unless he faced his own darkness, he would never be. And so she continued, her life widening like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. New people entered her world. Some stayed, some passed through, but none threatened her sense of self. She had learned that the most dangerous place for a woman to stand is in the shadow of someone else's opinion of her. Now she stood fully in her own light, and if anyone's gaze dimmed that light, she stepped away without hesitation. Time, in its quiet and merciless way, began to rewrite the edges of his memory. The sharpness of her image softened, but it did not fade. She became something else, less a person he had known and more a symbol that lived at the core of his unspoken longing. She was the embodiment of the woman he had not yet learned how to keep, the mirror that had once shown him what he could have been if he had met her with the same depth she had offered him. Eckhart would say he was still chasing his anima, the inner feminine that had appeared in flesh and blood, then withdrawn, forcing him to confront the void she left behind. In that void lay every mischance, every moment he had chosen distraction over presence, every time he had mistaken her stillness for indifference. This is the cruelty of loss without conflict. There is nothing to rage against except oneself. For her, time was not an eraser, but an architect. It built new structures in her life, habits that served her, rituals that honored her, people who met her without draining her spirit. Her detachment had become a way of living, not an act to prove anything. There was no private satisfaction in knowing he might still think of her. She no longer tied her value to the echoes of his desire. Eckhart Tolle would call this a shift in identity, a movement away from the pain body into pure presence. She was no longer the woman who once waited for him to see her. She was the woman who had already seen herself. And yet, even as she lived untouched by his shadow was shaped by her absence. The dreams persisted, but now they came with a strange, almost mystical quality. In some of them, she spoke, not in the way she had in life, but in cryptic sentences that felt like messages from somewhere beyond the mind. In others, she simply looked at him with eyes that seemed to know something he didn't. He would wake unsettled, as if the dream had been trying to tell him not about her, but about himself. He began to realize that no amount of chasing new faces could replicate what he had lost. The women who came after her were not lesser, but they were not her, not because of some magical quality she possessed, but because the connection they shared had been a rare alignment of timing, depth, and unspoken understanding. He had let it slip. Now, without that anchor, his connections felt like hollow performances, the lines spoken, but the meaning missing. She would have told him, if she still spoke to him, that this was his work to do alone, that the void was not hers to fill, and the dreams were not hers to interpret. That longing is a teacher, and if he stopped trying to numb it, it might just lead him to the part of himself he had abandoned long before he met her. But she did not tell him, because this was not her story anymore. It was his. In her own quiet way, she had transcended the dynamic they once inhabited. She no longer played the role of muse or mirror. She no longer existed in relation to his journey. She existed, simply and fully, in relation to herself. And it is this sovereignty, that kept her image alive in his mind. Not because she had made herself scarce as a strategy, but because she had truly become untouchable in spirit. The strange truth about detachment is that it often teaches the other person more than attachment ever could. When she had been close, he could dismiss her value as something ordinary. Now, from a distance, he could see that she had been extraordinary, not in grand gestures, but in the way she inhabited herself without apology. And though he could name it now, he could not reclaim it. Every so often, he would wonder where she was, what she was doing, whether she still thought of him. But he never asked, because deep down, he knew the answer. She had gone somewhere he could not follow until he dismantled the illusions that had once made him blind to her. And until that day came, if it ever did, she would remain the woman who left with grace and became the dream he could not wake from. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.